for this episode, we are continuing kind of the early land speed, hot rod history, and really get into what kind of helped lays the foundation for what we consider the hot rod industry. Because you got to remember, going back to the 20s and the 30s, we had, all the high-end, fancy sirs and British guys, beating land speed records, but there was also all the teenagers and the younger guys that were kind of trying to do the same thing.
You got to look at some of these guys that we've been talking about before. They were sirs and people of money, and let's just call them gentleman racers, where now we're getting into the scruff. We're getting into the guys that were actually just the regular mechanics that were working in their garage or maybe working on at a service station. So this is the fun stuff.
Yeah, no, and this really, at this point in the 1930s, a lot of the high-end, land speed racers, they kind of gravitated more towards Bonneville being kind of their spot, because by the late 30s, these guys were going 300 something miles an hour.
Right.
They needed the room, they needed the space, so they kind of not abandoned, but a lot of them weren't using like the dry lake beds as much anymore, and that opened it up to the younger guys to go out and try to emulate them.
Exactly.
So I got a quote from a magazine called Motor Age back in the 30s, and so this is from 1937 on May 16th. And let me just throw out this quote, because it was a big deal,
right?
For the time period and how many people, were in Los Angeles or in California. So over 10,000 people drove 125 miles from Los Angeles to spend 6 hours in blazing sunlight and alkali dust.
Yes.
Watching mechanical cocktails from all parts of the state show their speed at the Mirage dry lake bed. And that's, one thing too, we kind of, like for roadsters and stuff, there's like a Mirage style.
Right.
And that came from the family that owned that land for, long time in the 1800s and stuff like that, the Mirage.
Yeah.
But there was also, the El Mirage, the Harper Dry Lake. A lot of it was that high desert area of Southern California, which is more known kind of collectively as like Edwards Air Force Base.
Now it is currently, yes. And I mean, that's the thing too. Some of the most famous spacecrafts have landed at Edwards Air Force Base. Mm-hmm. But Edwards actually, or that whole area, is just a big, giant, open desert, flat land.
Yeah, like I said, it used to be a lake. At some point, it's just super flat, open.
Yeah.
You can see where you're going. You can see any obstructions and just go out and do whatever and, not worry about it.
Right.
And so that event was held by the Night Riders Club and the Mirage Timing Association.
Okay.
I think what we're focusing on a lot of is what has lasted, and that's the Southern California Timing Association.
Correct.
SCTA. That's still around today.
Yes.
They still are the governing, body for all the official timekeeping, the tech, service, the organizing of Bonneville, of El Mirage, the races and stuff that we have now. But they were founded in 1937.
Correct. And
it was founded by someone that probably you guys are familiar with, and his name is Wally Parks.
Right. Which most people think of him as Mr. NHRA.
Yeah, which he was a founder of NHRA. He was one of... We've had some discrepancies. We'll maybe dive into this more when we talk more about the history of Hot Rod Magazine and hot rods in post-World War II. But he's said to be the first or one of the first editors of Hot Rod Magazine.
That's right, yes.
Started then the Safety Safari, Motor Trend Magazine, and then obviously 1951, NHRA, National Hot Rod Association, which now we associate not as much really with hot rods. It's
more drag racing, right?
That's drag racing.
Yeah, it's drag racing, yeah.
But it's hot rods.
Yes.
Just the evolution of that.
Yes.
But we're going to go back into the 30s, go back to the early stages of what really kind of got these guys to head out to the desert, and what kind of cars that they were running out there, because they weren't your crazy 1,000 horsepower, Sunfire, Sunbeam Streamliners,
right?
That the land speed guys, these were Model Ts, maybe some Model A's at certain points, but a lot of these were you're just stripped down kind of classic hot rods that we think about.
Well, let's go back to that quote that you were saying, because you're right. At that time, the automotive world exploded in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And it made a lot of sense because everything in Los Angeles is very spread out. It's not like a New York where you walk a few blocks and you see most of the city.
Or don't even have a driver's license.
You don't even have a driver's license or even have a car,
Yeah.
right? But LA, being it's so spread out and so wide open that you could go out and have a few speed contests now and then and nobody really know until you start having accidents. And that's what was happening. A lot of people started getting, hurt, started getting killed. Obviously, Los Angeles was not known as, a very lawful town. So people were out there doing whatever they wanted. And it showed. So it was known to try to go out to some other place. And guys like Wally Parks was promoting more safety things, so they would take them out to the dry lakes. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I know 125 miles seems like a kind of a little bit of a drive, but really from here to El Mirage is not too bad. So to drive out there and to spend let's say a weekend would be no problem, or even to just drive out on a regular Thursday night and go have a speed contest. So why not?
Well, and that's there were some racetracks, but nothing really. You know, and one of the things we talked about, especially in the early episode with Bonnie Oldfield, is that you had these racing organizations, not the SCTA, but you had AAA, you had a lot of these racing organizations, but they were very strict.
Yes,
and that basically if they banned people if they did an exhibition.
Right.
They banned people if they went and raced somewhere else.
Right.
So for these guys, they were. Even though they started organizing themselves, they were still a little bit of the outlaws.
Exactly.
And the hot rod guys, and that's what the SCTA, found out, like you said, trying to promote safety, trying to promote some organization to it and organize some of these events. And a lot of that came from, there was a lot of car clubs that were popping up in the Southern California area, Los Angeles, San Diego.
Right.
And so a lot of they basically organized together to form these organizations for the timing and the, safety of it all.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. And so that's what, a couple of the early, clubs we talked about, there's Road Rebels, the Rumblers, even the San Diego Road Ramblers. A lot of those guys had their own timing associations during that time. But a couple of the main clubs that were involved in the SCTA were the Road Runners and then the Ablada Club. Which I'm hoping I'm saying that right.
I think you are too. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, there's not a whole lot of other ways to say it.
Yeah.
But yeah. I mean, there's a handful of other car clubs and stuff involved. But when you start looking through who were the season champions of each year of the SCTA, they belonged to either one of those two clubs,
right?
Basically, so those were obviously the key kind of guys,
right? And as you mentioned too, there was numerous clubs, but the top 5 clubs of the Southern California area were the real genesis of the SCTA being formed. So, but there's other the Rosetta. I'm sorry, said it wrong.
I mean, it's Rosetta, but
right.
Very similar. So that ended up that was another. Like you said, there's some of the car clubs had their own timing associations. Some of the specific lake beds had their own timing associations, like the Mirage Timing Association, Bell Timing Associate, like the Cal Neva, so Nevada, kind of California, that region. Yeah. But after actually World War II, so we're jumping ahead a little bit, the Rosetta Timing Association started up with 29 clubs, whereas after the World War II, SCTA expanded to 38 different clubs being members of it.
Sure.
So, these are pretty big.
Yeah.
You got to figure there's at least 5 guys probably in each car club.
Right.
Because otherwise it's not
not a car club. Yeah, right.
So you got to figure that's 100-something people as members of it. I mean, if all of these guys, are wanting to go out and make runs, that's a pretty good race and pretty fun day of running. But what's interesting is one of the main reasons that Rosetta Timing Association was started and some of these other clubs was because the SCTA until 1951 didn't allow anything other than a roadster or a streamliner.
Which seems crazy, right?
Yeah. I mean, big
deal. Run what you brung, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, so no 3-window coupes, no 5-window coupes, no sedans, no, 36 Fords with a full roof and all that. And I think for them, a lot of it was, we mentioned some of the gow jobs and the early pre-hot rod stuff where it was about getting as much weight off of the vehicle as possible, upgrading what you could, very similar fashion of what race cars are still to this day.
Exactly.
Eliminate weight, add more power, add better performance and handling.
Refinement.
I mean, refined may not be the word because they were still pretty clunky. They were jalopies.
Yeah.
But it was take the running boards off.
Exactly. Right.
Take the roof,
Yeah.
you're using a roadster, but you're taking all of that off, so it's permanently a roadster.
Right.
A lot of these guys maybe would swap in, if they had a Model T, they'd swap in some of the Model A stuff.
Right. Or even
bigger
use something,
flatheads.
Well, a LaSalle, like a LaSalle engine was very popular back then to put into a Model A.
Yeah, because
you got a Cadillac, you got a Cadillac V8 that you're putting into a small little, deuce.
Yeah,
basically.
exactly, and that's what. Yeah, it was take something that was meant for something with a lot more weight.
Right.
Put it in something with barely any weight.
Yeah.
And you're going to go faster.
Right.
So to them, I think a roadster's for them was always going to be the fastest.
Sure.
Because it was the most stripped down,
lightweight.
And then the Streamliner stuff was more popular with the hot rod guys, maybe a little bit later, but that was a carryover for sure from all the land speed racing.
Exactly.
Where that's what land speed racing went to.
Right. It's more of a purpose-built race car.
Yeah. And so, after the World War II, the Rosetta Timing Association, some of the other associations started to allow, when they started, to help get more people.
Right.
And because maybe the coupes and stuff would be more popular, they allowed them to race. And so it forced the SCTA in 1951 to actually allow classes that included, the coupes and sedans and some of the other, vehicles in there.
Yeah. But the times were changing, so you
had to adapt with it, otherwise, and that's what the SCTA is still around today,
right?
And you kind of have to adapt with what people are racing and what they want to race, and just let's create a class for them,
right, exactly.
But it was Rosetta Timing and those kind of, and a lot in the Coops Club that the Pearson brothers started that worked for Edelbrock,
right?
They really helped push, to have coupes, be part of hot rod.
Well, and that also too was kind of a lot of the sign of the times too, because remember, we're talking about what guys were buying and driving on the street, and then going there. It wasn't like I'm going to build an Indy car and go to Indy. No. It was like, this is what I'm driving every day. I want to show I'm the fastest guy, so I'm going to drive up to El Mirage and show you guys.
Yeah,
right.
Well, and a lot of it too was something that was 10, 15 years old and needed to be cobbled together and all that. And you're just starting with a shell basically and going like that. So those were kind of the roadsters. But then, if your guy was probably not driving a permanent roadster every day, not necessarily.
Right.
I mean, LA, you kind of could.
You could,
but, they probably had a 36 Ford coupe, and a lot of them did. Raced those and built those up. But, it wasn't until the early 50s basically, which is kind of crazy to think about, that it was only roadsters in the SCTA.
Well, let's take a look at this too, because you're talking let's go back to the year 1938. So
that'd be like the first full season, first time of the.
So 38, and you're driving what are you driving back then? A 26 something?
Well, and that's
right. You're not driving a 38 Chevy or something like that, because it's a brand new car.
No, and that's chances are you weren't. Especially this was the Great Depression, so it wasn't. A lot of people were looking towards the older, stuff, older cars. It's interesting. There's not a huge ton of backstory, but there's just enough. Came across a photo that's dated 1932.
Okay.
So, I mean, as early as you could think for hot rodding.
Right.
Probably as early as you could possibly think.
Yeah.
And it's a Model T.
Okay.
That's been stripped down. It's got a number on the side. It's got a number 3.
Okay.
I guess 3 has always been a popular number.
They knew for Dale.
But this is before Dale's
no, totally. His
father was born.
Yeah, exactly.
Probably his father might not have even born yet.
Yeah.
Well, no, it probably was. But, and then Edelbrock had 3 on the side as well. So I wonder if there's something
I don't know
to the 3 being a thing.
Isn't that a movie? No, it's number 23. Sorry.
23. Yeah. That's Michael Jordan.
Jim Carrey movie. It's a great movie.
Oh, and Michael Jordan.
And Michael Jordan. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But 3's the magic number, so maybe that's why.
Maybe that's what it is.
Who knows?
I don't know. Right.
Well, and maybe if you're number 1, everyone's gonna go after you because you're number 1. Maybe if you're number 3, you're like, hey, you're going in under the radar a little bit,
right? Because you don't want to be number 2, because number 2 is just the first loser. Right?
So if you're number 3, you're like, hey, I got places.
I'm on podium,
but I still got some places to go. So
maybe that's it.
Who knows?
Yeah.
But it said 1932 Mirage champ, and it's 2 guys look probably in their teenagers with a trophy on the hood, and it's a Model T stripped down with then either like 1924 or 25 Model A rear end.
Yeah.
You can see they put a
banjo style
banjo
deal.
rear end on there.
Right.
No fenders, nothing like that. So, but you're mentioning, so that was 1932.
Right.
I'm curious to know there wasn't any timing associations really at that point, it seemed.
Right.
Maybe the Mirage timing association, but because obviously someone had to give a trophy.
Yeah.
But you talk about 1938, and talk about the speed that these guys were going.
Right.
And the first time, like by this time we were almost already at 300 with the land speed.
Sure.
Or I think maybe even a little bit above that.
Right. Yeah, John Cobb's right around that area because we're 38. John Cobb's,
because I think it was 39 that maybe he.
Yeah. So we're close to that. Yeah.
Yeah. But so like, one of the guys that was the very first champion was Ernie McAfee or McAfee, and he went 136 miles an hour in 1938.
Right. Now think about that, though.
I was say, but also think about doing that in a car that sounds like and feels like it's going to fall apart.
Right.
Yeah.
And not only that, too, I mean, some of these guys are going faster than that car ever was intended. Times two.
Yeah,
right.
Because especially if you're talking about a Model T or something, they were maybe meant to go 50 miles an hour.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
So you're looking at this thing going, miles ahead. Sure, it's not going 300 miles an hour. That's a streamliner that was built to go 300 miles an hour. This is something that Henry Ford made, and someone drove around for a few years, and then somebody decided to hop it up.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So it's wheelbase comes into play now. Track width comes into play. You're going 100 and something miles an hour with a steering wheel that's probably this big, and you're trying to steer the thing down the road.
Yeah. I
mean, very sketchy.
You got a lot of room out there, but still there's a mountain right there.
And let's also talk about that alkali dust, because I do remember growing up and riding my dirt bike, at El Mirage. And when you say alkali dust, it's like...
It's a very fine dust that gets in everywhere.
Everywhere. And it's like, even when you walk on it, it billows like smoke. Mm-hmm. It's just this super fine silt.
Yeah,
and
silt would be a good,
gets in everything, and also, too, it gives you a weird, read of the land.
Why? Because it ripples in the...
Because it ripples, right? But also, too, it doesn't show you highs or lows, because it's all the same color, so it doesn't shadow.
Oh,
so it's really kind of sketchy as you're,
Well, and there's no rocks. There's no rocks or anything out there, which is obviously good.
Yeah.
But then, that doesn't really show you as much.
But also the pricker bushes that they kind of tumbleweeds, right? They kind of make their own mound. So also too, there's an area where there's like a bunch of mounds.
Oh, yeah.
So you have to kind of stay out of the mounds. Basically.
Yeah, there's a certain area to do it, and that's what helps them with these organizations to kind of okay, this is the safe. This is the set
trap.
area. Don't go off-roading on your own.
Right.
Stuff like that.
Right. Because what's interesting too is the El Mirage track was closed. Obviously, after the war, they closed the El Mirage part of it for Edwards Air Force Base. Mm-hmm. And the funny thing about that is that they turned the actual timing area, like where they would run the cars, they turned that into a private little landing strip. So people would come down. I mean, even too, in the 80s when I was riding my dirt bike over there, people would land their Cessnas,
like a small plane,
and then take off. Even a lot of people used to do that. So they would kind of touch and go and teach people how to land a plane and fly off. So it's a big area, right? And it's very wide open and smooth. But again, too, if you 4 o'clock when the shadows start to kind of come down, all of a sudden you don't notice that the thing kind of does this. And if you're in an old jalopy going, I don't know,
that was part of the sketchy.
Right,
that was part of the appeal.
Yeah,
part of the the whole kind of deal about it.
Right.
And that's because and Ernie McAfee was 1938 season champ. So he was the first season champ. He ended up getting killed at the Pebble Beach Grand Prix a couple decades later. Driving a Ferrari.
Right.
But it just kind of shows you a little bit of some of these guys.
Yeah. He made a living
It was their
driving.
entry into racing, essentially.
Yeah, and that's what happened to him. He became a professional driver.
Yeah.
So I mean, he had a career, obviously ended short, but he still ended up being his occupation.
Yeah. We mentioned earlier, some of the car clubs that came together to kind of form the SCTA and these organizations. Ernie was a roadrunner, which was actually the SCTA Roadrunners.
Right.
So I guess they were kind of the official club, if you will, or one of the main clubs.
The cool kids.
They were the guys.
Yeah.
But you had a couple champs that were part of the Albata Car Club, and one of the first guys for that was Bob Ruffey, 1940. Mm-hmm. So still pre-war.
Yeah.
But out at Harper Dry Lakes, he went 143. So Not much more than 136 that, Ernie did a couple years prior, but still, like we said, going 140 in that compared to going, 140 and I mean, we could now say like going 120 miles an hour in a car on the freeway that's a new modern car, like
no big deal.
It's
fast.
But it's not. You don't feel super crazy. Like if you're in a BMW or something, and you're going 120 on the freeway, we do not condone that.
Yes.
We've maybe done it, but we do
Filmed
not
in Mexico.
condone it.
Yes.
It doesn't really feel like it. It feels like you're maybe going 90 in like a regular car on the freeway.
Right.
So imagine going 140 miles an hour 100 years ago almost in something that was made 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And wasn't exactly the most engineered, put together correctly. These were backyard, hot rods.
I mean,
and jallopys is what they called them.
Put a rocket on your Volkswagen Tiguan is pretty much the same equivalent, right? Yeah.
As far as technology and speed goes.
Yeah.
But yeah, and another guy that was in that same car club that was the 1942 champ and kind of helped, keep things together during the war.
Right.
Was Carl Orr.
Carl Orr, yeah.
Yeah, and that was Orr Speed Shops,
right.
A name that we've heard as well, quite often.
Which is fun because everyone's heard of the Bell Speed Shop. That's your first speed shop.
Yeah.
Right? At LA, whatever. Mm-hmm. Carl was kind of like the runner-up to that. He's kind of right in between Blair Speed Shop and Bell Speed Shop, kind of in the whole timeline. Mm-hmm. SoCal Speed Shop's not even there yet.
Yeah.
So Carl started a speed shop with his wife, who was also very heavily involved in the sport as well. She was kind of a dragon lady. Like, she kind of had a reputation of being kind of a hard person to be around. But so what? There's always a dragon lady in every form of racing. There's somebody's wife that always speaks up. I swear to God. But
makes sense.
But the nice thing was that Carl knew everybody because he was the speed shop. Mm-hmm. I mean, people would come in, they'd see him, they'd get advice from him, they'd buy parts, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, probably every time there was a race coming up, guys would be in there,
exactly,
getting ready for it or buying something to get ready for it.
Right, and the nice thing about Carl was the guy. He was a little bit older than most of the other guys, and he was married. So when the war came around, he wasn't drafted.
Okay,
right. So
whereas a lot of these guys that were, I mean, especially you think World War II. I mean, if you were 16, 17, 18, up to probably like
25.
I said even maybe a little older than that. You were getting drafted.
You're getting drafted.
Yeah.
So Carl was a little bit older, and Wally actually got drafted. Mm-hmm. So when Wally went to war, off to the war, there was no one there to kind of like keep information flowing.
Yeah. So because there still were a couple. Obviously the U.S. officially went into war in 1941.
Right.
Didn't really get too heavy until 43, 44.
Yeah.
So like even until 1942, there was still a SCTA timing run, and Carl Orr was the season champ that year.
Yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah. So still things kind of kept going, but there was a couple years then where it was like, okay, none of it's really happening.
But that's why Carl's so important, because Carl was the guy that kept the newsletter going.
Yeah.
So that kept information flowing to even guys that are like, hey, I'm in the SCTA timing club, fan club. Hey, can you write me a letter? Yeah, that was the newsletter.
And there's probably a lot of those guys that were overseas,
right?
Getting either that newsletter or getting information coming back that, and so it's keeping people's interest in it.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's why he was a big part of that. Again, yes, he was a season champ, but he wasn't the powerhouse of speed. He was more of the guy that kept everybody together.
Yeah. Just kind of kept the ship, boat sailing in the right direction.
Right.
Kind of not waiting, but like, once everyone got back from World War II, it really exploded. We'll get into that a lot more later.
He left the light on for everybody.
There you go. Yeah. There you go. And that's, you talk about, so he had owned the speed shop, but a lot of these early hot rod guys and SCTA guys, they were younger that were, going around.
Yeah.
I know you mentioned a couple, pretty innovative kids, literally kids, the Spalding brothers that, were in high school at that time. And then obviously,
Bill and Tom Spalding, they, of course they had their entry that they put into there. And what they figured out is that it was running out of ignition timing on the big end of the track. So they hit a wall as far as trying to go any faster because their ignition system was failing.
Yeah.
Their high school auto shop teacher assisted those guys in developing. They took 2 coils out of a Lincoln, and they basically merged them together, and they figured out how to boost the ignition system of their car. So instead of it, only
so you could have
like
timing kind of like for one.
Well, it had like a turbo booster.
Kick on later. Yeah, kind
right.
of. Yeah.
So, they were having a problem. I think they couldn't get over like 4,500 RPM. So this allowed them to go to 6,000.
Yeah. Okay.
And 6,000 on the bigger end of a track. Obviously, if you're still pulling and still accelerating as you're going faster, you're going to go faster.
Yeah.
So
well, that's because in 1938, they went 132 miles an hour, which is just shy of what Ernie McAfee did that same year.
Yeah. But then they went to algebra the next day.
Exactly.
I mean, that's the thing to think about, right? I mean,
they were in high school.
Right? Yeah. So, and also too, I mean, who's the shop teacher back then to figure out like, oh, you guys are running out of power. We need to turn up that magneto a little bit, right? I mean,
that's I mean, you wonder about, we're talking about these guys. It's kind of like, where did that?
We didn't.
Who was the high school teacher?
That's what I'm saying, right?
We knew some of this stuff.
We didn't have a Hot Rod magazine as a reference. We didn't have a guy on TV saying like, "Hey, this is how fast we can go, and this is what we can." No, it was like word of mouth. You went to the event, you found out who the cool kids were, you got their
some
secret,
ideas,
right?
Yeah.
You went back, you tried it 1,500 times until it worked.
Yeah,
and
I'm sure too, probably a lot of those guys when it, the whole thing, invention's the mother all of necessity. All that stuff is. Probably some of those guys trying to figure something out that someone else did or trying to do it, then maybe figured something else out on their own.
Oh, 100%.
Or figured out another way to do it.
Yeah.
And that's how things evolve and, things get innovative is just people trying to figure it out and, either copy someone else or add their own spin on it, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And, so we didn't necessarily, so that you talk about that, like basically kind of the invention of a new ignition system.
Right.
But that wasn't like an available part necessarily.
No. I mean, again, they kind of cobbled together a few different, items to make one work.
Yeah.
And it just kind of showed the way that, we need to start looking at ignition, which is, something very other similar story. So let's talk about Vic Edelbrock Sr.
And that's what I was going for is like, we had speed shops. We didn't really have parts meant exactly for that genre of racing.
Yeah.
Or available to sell it. It was just figuring something out or customizing it or modifying it.
Yeah. It's almost like a mashup of just different, let's take a part off of here, a part off of there and put it onto this chariot and see what I can do.
Well, and that falls exactly into what they had already recognized even back as far as, in that article that I mentioned of mechanical cocktails.
Yeah, right.
They were mixing and matching, like a cocktail. They were mixing and matching different parts, different cars to get the best performance out of it that they could.
Well, and also too, let's step back into just even general life at that time. Opportunity was California. Right? So Vic Edelbrock was from the Midwest.
Yeah.
And he followed his brothers out here because they were having some success with just being regular garages.
Well, and that's, like I said, Midwest, Dust Bowl.
Yeah.
Great Depression, like a lot of people were moving from the Midwest to California, whether it was Southern California, Central California, just
didn't matter.
Way more opportunity, way more jobs. It was the pattern of migration, if you will, at that time.
Exactly.
And made sense.
Right. So Vic, he same thing, moved out here, followed his brothers. His brothers had a couple of garages, so he started his own garage. Was looking at what was going on at the time, and obviously too, Bobby Meeks showed up at his shop, who was a 15-year-old kid that was like, you need to do that, right? I mean, he's the kid that's out there riding his bike around, watching these guys have fun. So Vic Edelbrock says, okay, I'll pick up a car, starts doing that kind of stuff, starts going out to Mirage, going out to El Mirage, and started to be kind of the standout out there. But Vic was smart. Vic bought a dyno, like early. And that was, so he could tune a car.
Well, and that's, you could test out without having to go to the lake bed. You could actually test out what you did. How did it change it? Was it better or worse until,
And not only that, he could test. He could hey, that didn't work. Oh, this worked. Okay. And like you said, you didn't have to drive 125 miles out there to go find out, right?
Yeah.
So he was a guy, he was developing parts, so he knew that he could make the engine faster. He could make a flathead better. He could make more horsepower out of it. So during that time, he perfected the slingshot manifold. So you went from one single carburetor on that top of that flathead that made 40 horsepower?
Yeah.
To 2 carburetors that had this kind of slingshot kind of look to it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, you kind of have that split. Yeah.
Right. So, and obviously too, Slingshot, it went way faster. So, I mean, the name stuck.
Yeah, good marketing for him.
Exactly. And that kind of put not only just Vic on the map as the guy, but it put Edelbrock, the company, on the map, because now you had to have a Slingshot manifold if you were going to go fast.
Well, and that's what I think, especially by that time period, you're thinking, okay, they've maxed out how much weight you can take off of a car.
Right.
Like there's only so much you can take off.
Yeah.
You know, or modify or change in that regard. You've already got what you've taken. You already kind of have maybe maxed out or taken. Okay, what engine can we take from this car?
Yeah.
What brakes or what suspension can we take from that car?
Right.
And put on here. So it's kind of like the potential has already maxed out.
Yeah.
So now it's going to need to be someone actually doing custom parts, custom modifications,
right,
in order to make it go any faster than it already was. So it made perfect sense that now you have to start making your own parts and developing your own ways to enhance everything versus just swapping stuff in.
And there you go. The industry's born.
Yeah.
Because that's now the average guy can buy a speed part and put it onto his car and be one of those superheroes.
Yeah. But the industry wasn't born just yet.
Right.
Because there's World War II that happened.
A little something in the way.
So, yeah, Vic Edelbrock was the SCTA champion in 1941.
Right.
And then we mentioned that, Carl Orr was the 42 season champ.
Yeah.
And then everyone else went all to war.
They go to war, yeah.
But that's where then all these guys refined their skills. Even more people were more interested.
And they learned so much during the war.
And the technology boom that happened during the war really helped. I mean, the common examples would be like radar, microwaves, obviously nuclear power, all that stuff. But like just small things, just the quality of materials, the fittings, the hardware being used, even just stuff like that drastically improved during the war.
It had to.
Because it had to. It had to be for the reliability, the punishment they were taking it through. So, and then you obviously had guys that were working on Harley-Davidson motorcycles.
Exactly.
Guys that were working on Jeeps, working on all these, tanks and aircraft.
Right.
That then came back and would apply it.
Right.
To the hot rod racing that they enjoyed, or maybe they had heard their buddy that was in the Army with them was doing. He's showing these pictures of his hot rod, talking about all the cool stuff. Well, then that guy's inspired to try to do it, and one of the things too is you got to look at, the war. That war brought guys from New York, Texas, California all together in the same, foxhole.
Yeah.
And so they're talking, they're sharing ideas, they're sharing what they do, what they're into.
Yeah.
And a lot of the guys then after the war, because they were maybe stationed in California or stationed somewhere else than where they grew up, they then lived there.
Right. They liked it. They stayed.
Yeah. So a lot of that happened then in LA or in the Southern California area.
And a lot of times too, a lot of, just like you mentioned, a lot of your foxhole buddies became your household buddies.
Yeah.
Because they were just like, why would I want to move away? This guy's now my lifelong friend. I might as well live in this whole area.
That's your guy that you trust and they know and they become friends. So, the SCTA then started back up, 1946 after the war. But like we mentioned, they didn't have coupes.
Yeah.
They didn't have sedans until 1951.
Right.
And that's all. 1951 is also then when Wally Parks went and founded the NHRA.
Right.
The drag racing kind of side of it.
Yeah.
And started having, where now we're going on tracks.
Right.
Versus dirt.
And now we're going in places that are close to the house instead of driving 125 miles out into the desert.
No, and that's true.
Right?
Yeah, as LA and even other parts of the country started to grow and expand
and that's very important because Nebraska doesn't have a dry lake.
Yeah.
So when the NHRA came out, it made more sense. Oh, we could do this here. We could do it in Chicago.
Yeah,
we
you just need to find an open spot of land.
Right.
And
now it was a different deal.
Lay down some asphalt. Right. Yeah.
And also, too, you had infrastructure. You had somebody like, think about in the 50s, there's a lot of like the transcontinental highways being built.
Yeah.
The 10 freeway.
Yeah.
Okay.
All the freeways being
now pavement is becoming a big deal. So
it's becoming normal.
Exactly. Yeah. So you don't have as many dirt roads. You don't have as many country roads as they called them.
Yeah.
Now you have a paved, curbed, licensed, kind of basically a spec. Whereas before, out in the desert, it's just, hey, go to that tumbleweed, and that's the finish line.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and what I find that's pretty cool too is, so like we talked about all these clubs start getting real organized after, World War II, these speed shops, we mentioned SoCal Speed Shop. We'll get into that later on. Even, Robert Peterson starting Hot Rod Magazine, and, him, Wally Parks, like those guys were obviously then very just promoting, their whole entire goal was promoting hot rodders as a professional racing type of a league, not the, the
delinquent youth that are out
the
there,
rebel kids and stuff. But what I do find is pretty cool is that even as we talk about how like the late 40s and early 1950s, especially, everything was being very organized and safety and all this stuff. That's also the time period that we look at of the rebel teenagers and the cool kids and the rock and rolls kind of starting to come about, and the street racing and or like the apple orchards.
Yes.
In Central California, let's go racing out in the apple orchard.
Right.
Of course, now you go a little bit to the right and you're crashing into a tree, but it was still an open straight line.
Right. Well, you don't think about crashing when you're racing.
No, of course. You just know, I'm going to go straight. I'm good.
Line, right, yeah.
Good. But that's what's cool is that even as the industry started, you still had that next generation of underground rebel teenagers that were coming up and doing their own thing, kind of keeping the momentum going for that kind of scene.
Let's take a look at this too, because even too, like, let's go back to those Mirage days where they're having pretty much Burning Man for cars.
Yeah, well, that's
right.
We mentioned even 1938, it was 10,000 people.
Yeah,
that all literally where there's probably nobody that lives out there, or very few people that live out there at the time. They weren't probably going to it.
No,
so it was 10,000 people making a trek
from Los Angeles,
from L.A.
right
out to the lake bed.
And there were, Mickey Rooney, who was a huge movie star at the time, and a younger guy though. Now he'd be your, I don't know, I can't think of a young artist. But anyways,
I was going to say you're probably about to say Leonardo DiCaprio, who's in his 50s.
In his 50s, right? Yeah, but so a predominant Hollywood star had
a young star,
which
most of the young stars still are into cars,
exactly,
or into racing or doing something.
Yeah. Well, he had a car. He went out and raced that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So this was new. This was exciting. This was the in thing to do.
Yeah.
Right.
And it was a very LA popular thing because of cars being more popular in Los Angeles. And we talk about a lot of racing that happened in the Midwest and a lot of stuff. But if you want to start talking about then the foundation of hot rod, foundation of the industry, it's Southern California.
It is.
And a lot of that, had to do, we'll get into a little bit with aerospace being here.
That too as well.
So all the mechanics, the machinery,
and
the foundries that these guys needed to start these parts and create the industry were here already.
Right.
From World War II, like the guy was already working at that factory.
Yeah.
So maybe that factory, then now he's working on his own little shop, but he still has a buddy that can go, hey, let me cast that for you.
I can say the same thing. I worked for Northrop when I got out of high school in the 80s. And believe me, everybody at Northrop had some type of hot rod. I even built,
and that's even in the 80s. We're talking 50 years later.
We're talking 50 years later. I even built stuff working at Northrop.
Yeah, it was just kind of part of the thing to do.
It was that everyone did that. Mm-hmm. We kind of didn't know any better, so it worked out pretty well.
But that's definitely kind of the early foundation of the hot rod guys starting to become organized, starting to really grow the industry and lay the foundation for the hot rod explosion, if you will.
If you think about it now, sideshows and takeovers are happening.
And that's what we've harped on this on a few different occasions, is the same pattern. And even us as like mini truck guys, a lot of the hot rod guys wouldn't accept us or didn't like us at their cruise nights.
Yep.
And it's like, you got to remember, like, hey, maybe you are the professional hot rod racing guy, but remember where you came from, or where your genre came from, because these guys were organizing in the 30s. We'll pop up a bunch of newspaper headlines and stuff like that of like rebel rodders and teenagers causing havoc on the streets and in the 40s and the 50s and all that. Same thing then happened with drifting. Same thing happened with street racing. You know, same thing happened with sideshow. You know, all this stuff that people are going to do and try to do their own thing in their own version because they're not accepted by whoever the governing body was. Because same thing, like these guys out of Mirage were probably not welcome with the land speed Sir Malcolm Campbell's.
Nope.
So they had to do their own thing.
That's right.
And that's the same pattern throughout history with what's still considered hot rodding.
Exactly. And thank God, too. I mean, because that's the other thing. If we were still doing the same thing if we were still out there racing at Mirage right now.
Well, and that's the thing. It's there's always cycles that happen with that, you know, but, you know, we mentioned before, like Hot Rod Magazine. Okay, that's hot rod, but you'll have a muscle car on the cover.
Right.
Or you'll have a truck or something. You know, it's just a general term.
It's a lot better than gal jobs, too, by the way.
Yeah. I mean, jalopy I always liked.
I like jalopy, too.
That's a nice, you got the jalopy journal and all that kind of stuff.
Seems like Archie's cartoon, like Jughead's going to drive a jalopy. That's what I always kind of associate.
Well, and that's the jalopies weren't exactly the nice hot rods or
Right.
street rods. But what is interesting is you talk about like, if we still were racing out at El Mirage or something, it's like, so yeah, for several decades, there weren't any official racing out at El Mirage because of the Air Force Base.
That's right.
And because they were doing NHRA, it was kind of like, forgotten about. But 1996, SCTA brought back El Mirage Racing.
Right.
As kind of like, hey, here's maybe a nostalgia kind of
I'm sure
throwback to where we came from. But,
yeah.
They still run 4 races out at El Mirage every year.
Yeah.
That are official races, as well as like the 2, I think, of, Bonneville.
Right.
So, that kind of helped bring back a little bit of the traditional hot rods that became even more popular, a decade later and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
Because now you could kind of relive that time period.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, if as long as you like to clean your car, I'll tell you that.
It's the same thing if you're going out the salt flats.
That's true. That's true.
I mean,
yeah. Pick your poison, I guess, on that deal.
Yeah. But I mean, that's why I guess they started doing more street racing and doing more, racing out at the NHRA drag strips.
Yeah.
So we'll be getting into kind of both of those and more on the industry as we know it, or at least the foundations of it, in the next episode.